The morning of February 23, 1945, hung thick with sulfur and smoke over Airfield No. 1 on Iwo Jima. At just past 10:30 in the morning, Corporal Herschel Woodrow Williams stood among his fellow Marines, listening as an officer called for volunteers. What was being asked of them was something most men would refuse. Someone needed to operate the flamethrower against the Japanese pillboxes that had pinned down the entire regiment for 3 days. The previous operator had been killed just hours before, shot clean through the head as he approached a bunker, the heavy tanks still strapped to his back when they recovered what was left. There was a long pause. Every Marine in that moment understood exactly what was being asked. A flamethrower operator was essentially a walking target, carrying 68 pounds of liquid fire across open ground while every Japanese rifle, every machine gun, every mortar would focus on him alone. The weapon made you instantly recognizable, instantly prioritized for death. Williams stepped forward. Someone had to do it, he would explain later. We couldn't stay there forever. Men were dying for nothing. At least if I tried, we might accomplish something. Standing just 5 feet 6 inches tall, this quiet farm boy from West Virginia was about to undertake one of the most extraordinary individual actions of the entire Pacific War. In the hours that followed, Williams would destroy multiple Japanese reinforced concrete pillboxes. The exact count remains contested by historians, ranging from 3 to 7, using that heavy flamethrower. His assault would shatter a brutal 3-day stalemate, push the 21st Marines forward 300 yards, and prove that individual courage could fundamentally alter the shape of a major battle. To understand what Williams faced that morning, you needed to understand Iwo Jima itself. The island represented something unprecedented in Japanese defensive strategy. Under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's direction, the entire island had been transformed into perhaps the most elaborate defensive position ever constructed. Kuribayashi had served as a military attaché in the United States back in the 1920s, traveling across America, observing its industrial power, its capacity for production. He knew Japan could never match American material superiority. His strategy was brutal in its simplicity: make the Americans pay the highest possible cost for every yard of volcanic ash. Over 8 months, the Japanese had orchestrated a staggering construction effort. 21,000 workers, soldiers and Korean laborers had excavated more than 11 miles of tunnels. These weren't simple passages. They created an intricate subterranean network connecting approximately 5,000 cave positions and 300 separate fixed fortifications. The effort had been punishing. Workers labored in temperatures ranging from 86 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit, breathing in sulfur fumes so intense that gas masks became mandatory equipment. 1/4 of the entire garrison, roughly 5,000 men, was dedicated solely to tunneling work. The pillboxes facing Williams were nothing like simple bunkers. These were sophisticated weapons platforms constructed with reinforced concrete walls up to 4 feet thick, multiple interior chambers, interconnected tunnels running between positions, and ventilation systems specifically engineered to handle flamethrower attacks. The Japanese had studied American tactics from island battles that came before Iwo Jima. They believed, with genuine confidence, that they had created positions capable of withstanding any assault. The M22 flamethrower Williams weighed 68 pounds when fully loaded with 4 gallons of thickened gasoline. It could project flame up to 132 feet maximum, though its effective range was closer to 65 feet. The operator carried enough fuel for roughly 7 or 8 seconds of continuous fire. But experienced operators like Williams understood that survival meant using short bursts, conserving fuel, maintaining tactical flexibility. The psychological impact of the weapon exceeded its physical capabilities. Death by flame represented a unique horror in warfare, one that challenged Japanese concepts of honorable death in battle. It had become essential for reducing Japanese fortifications throughout the Pacific, but the cost to those who wielded it was staggering. Flamethrower operators had the shortest life expectancy of any specialty in the entire theater. They were immediately identifiable. They became priority targets for every enemy weapon that could possibly bear on them. Herschel Woodrow Williams hadn't planned to be a Marine at all. He was born October 2, 1923 in Quiet Dell, West Virginia, a place so small it barely registered on any map. He was the youngest of 11 children, raised on a 35-acre dairy farm during the depths of the Great Depression. His father died when Williams was only 11 years old, leaving his mother to raise the family through a poverty so grinding it shaped every part of Williams' character, a resilience that would matter profoundly on Iwo Jima. He tried to enlist right after Pearl Harbor, but they rejected him. He was too short. The minimum height requirement stood at 5 feet 8 inches, and Williams measured just 5 feet 6. He waited, frustrated, until May 1943, when the Marine Corps, desperate for bodies as casualties climbed, finally lowered their standards. That's when he got in. Williams would joke afterward that the Marines were simply looking for people small enough to make harder targets. He joined the 21st Marines of the 3rd Marine Division as a demolition specialist, training with Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges. It wasn't until July 1944 on Guam that he first used a flamethrower in actual combat. He discovered something unexpected, an aptitude for the weapon, a way of thinking about it that went beyond most Marines' approach. Unlike many flamethrower operators who used the weapon once and never wanted to touch it again, Williams developed something like a methodical philosophy. He understood that survival depended on tactics every bit as much as on courage. He learned to think about positioning, about angles of attack, about how the weapon could be used in ways that defied standard doctrine. By the morning of February 23, 1945, the Battle for Iwo Jima had been raging for 4 days. That very morning, Marines had raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, first at 10:30, then the more famous second flag raising in the early afternoon that would be captured in Joe Rosenthal's iconic photograph. But that flag raising, symbolically important as it was, didn't mean the battle was won. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders who had started the invasion, more than 19,000 were still alive, still waiting in their tunnels and bunkers. The 21st Marines had been trying to advance across the open ground near Airfield No. 1 for 3 days. Every attempt had been repulsed with devastating casualties. The Japanese had pre-registered every single square meter with mortars and machine guns. Artillery bounced off the bunkers. Naval gunfire proved useless. 6 Sherman tanks had been destroyed trying to advance. The Japanese had positioned anti-tank guns in concealed locations that would let the tanks pass through before hitting them from behind. The morning of February 23rd found the Marines trapped in a deadly stalemate. They had lost approximately 40% of their strength in 72 hours without advancing even 50 yards. The pillboxes controlling the airfield approach had to be eliminated, but every conventional tactic had failed completely. The situation demanded something different. It demanded someone willing to do what seemed impossible. At 11:15 in the morning, with covering fire from 4 riflemen and support from 2 Sherman tanks, Williams made his first approach toward the Japanese positions. What he did next went against everything in standard flamethrower doctrine. Instead of advancing quickly under covering fire and unleashing long bursts of flame before retreating, Williams moved with deliberate slowness. He crawled between shell holes, using the smallest rises in terrain for cover. When Japanese machine guns opened up, he didn't retreat or rush forward. He waited, sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes, until the gunners convinced themselves he had been driven back or killed. That first approach to the opening pillbox took 45 minutes to cover perhaps 60 yards. Marines watching from behind positions thought they had seen him killed several times, only to spot him moving again, still advancing. When he finally reached effective range, roughly 35 yards from the bunker, Williams employed a technique that would become his signature. He didn't unleash his flame in a single long burst that would empty his tanks. Instead, he fired a short jet, perhaps 1 second of flame, at the bunker's main aperture. The fire didn't penetrate deeply into the structure, but it did one crucial thing: it obscured the vision ports. As the Japanese defenders shifted to their alternate firing positions, Williams had already moved, circling to attack from a different angle entirely. The first pillbox fell at just after noon, but Williams wasn't stopping. Instead of withdrawing to refuel as every tactical manual said he should, he moved immediately toward the second pillbox, using the smoke and confusion from the first as cover for his approach. What made Williams' assault extraordinary wasn't just courage, it was tactical innovation. He had discovered something the Japanese hadn't anticipated. Those elaborate tunnel systems, designed to be their greatest strength, could become death traps when filled with smoke. The ventilation systems engineered to expel flamethrower attacks couldn't handle smoke flowing through the tunnels themselves. Williams developed a technique of using short bursts not just to conserve fuel, but to create maximum psychological impact. He would aim at one port, causing defenders to shift in anticipation of a flamethrower attack that wouldn't come, while he moved to strike from another angle entirely. He discovered something else about those pillboxes. Many of them couldn't elevate their guns enough to cover their own roofs. Despite the extreme danger of exposure, Williams sometimes climbed onto a pillbox to attack through ventilation ports that the defenders thought were safe. It was reckless and brilliant in equal measure. While Williams drew the attention and fire of the Japanese positions, the Marines protecting him fought their own desperate battle. The 4 riflemen assigned to cover him had to suppress multiple positions simultaneously, while Williams worked against a single target. These Marines developed an intuitive coordination with him over those hours. When he moved left, they shifted right to cover his flank. When he went to ground, they increased their rate of fire to keep Japanese heads down. When he charged, they followed, transforming his individual assault into something larger, a coordinated attack. The Sherman tanks provided crucial support, their 75mm guns suppressing positions that threatened Williams. But the tanks themselves were vulnerable. Japanese anti-tank guns remained active, and tank commanders knew that staying in one position too long meant death. Williams returned to American lines at 12:45 to refuel. His tanks were empty, his uniform singed and torn, minor shrapnel wounds from near misses marking his skin. By any reasonable measure, he had done enough. At least 2 major positions were destroyed. The attack could proceed now. Surely he had satisfied what had been asked of him. But as the refueling team worked, Williams studied the Japanese positions through binoculars, planning his next approach. At 1:15, he started his second run into the fire. This time, there were no illusions about surprise. The Japanese knew he was coming. Every position in the sector had been alerted. Machine guns were pre-sighted on likely approaches. Mortar teams had calculated ranges. Yet Williams advanced into this coordinated storm of fire using the same techniques he had developed in his first assault. He would reach cover, a destroyed vehicle, a shell hole, a knocked-out Japanese gun position, and wait for fire to concentrate on his location. Then, while the Japanese fired at where he had been, he would already be moving to where he was going. Marines watching observed him dodging between bursts of machine gun fire, seeming to anticipate where the rounds would land. One of the most heavily fortified positions Williams faced housed a Japanese command post with radio equipment. Historical evidence suggests this position had been specifically reinforced and contained veteran troops. When Williams approached at approximately 3 in the afternoon, Japanese sources indicate the defenders attempted something unusual, a coordinated response from multiple camouflaged positions simultaneously, a crossfire designed to be inescapable. Williams was caught in the open. According to Marine witnesses, he was hit and spun around by a bullet impact. For a moment, observers thought they had watched him die, but the bullet had struck his ammunition pouch without penetrating through. Williams regained his feet and continued his assault. What happened next entered Marine Corps legend. With minimal fuel remaining, Williams approached the final positions using captured Japanese grenades along with his flamethrower. He would wave the flamethrower nozzle at one port, causing defenders to shift position again in anticipation of a flamethrower attack that wouldn't come, while throwing grenades through other openings. By 3:47 in the afternoon, Williams had been in continuous combat for over 4 hours. His final assault complete, he began his withdrawal under heavy fire. As he crossed back into American lines at 4:15, he collapsed from exhaustion. The immediate tactical impact was dramatic. The 21st Marines advanced 300 yards in the next 2 hours, gaining more ground than they had in the previous 3 days. The airfield's approach was finally open. More importantly, Williams had demonstrated that the Japanese fortifications everyone believed to be impregnable could be defeated by determined individuals using innovative tactics. The exact number of pillboxes Williams destroyed remains a subject of historical debate. Popular accounts cite 7. But Williams' Medal of Honor citation doesn't specify a precise number, stating only that he worked to wipe out one position after another. Military historian Brian Mark Riggs' research suggests 3, possibly 4. Williams himself, in later interviews, admitted that much of that day remained absolutely blank due to the intensity of combat and the fog that fills memory during such extremes. What is completely undisputed is that his actions broke the stalemate and saved countless Marine lives. Williams paid a price for his heroism that wasn't fully understood for decades. The physical toll was immediate and severe. He lost 20 pounds in 4 hours. His core body temperature reached dangerous levels. His hands were burned from the hot flamethrower nozzle, and his hearing was permanently damaged from the constant explosions. But the psychological toll ran deeper still. Williams never used a flamethrower again after Iwo Jima. When asked why, he answered simply, "I'd done enough burning for one lifetime." In later interviews, he would reveal the lasting impact of those hours. "People think courage means not being afraid," he said. "That's wrong. I was terrified every second. Every bunker I approached I thought would be my last." The images stayed with him, decade after decade. 40 years later, in a 1985 interview, Williams admitted, "I still smell it in my dreams." You don't forget something like that. You learn to carry it with you, but the memory stays sharp. On October 5, 1945, President Harry Truman stood beside Williams at the White House and presented him with the Medal of Honor, the highest recognition the nation could bestow. The official citation detailed his extraordinary actions. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as a demolition sergeant serving with the 21st Marines, 3rd Marine Division, in action against enemy Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands, 23rd of February 1945. When our tanks attempted repeatedly to break through the network of reinforced concrete pillboxes, buried mines and volcanic terrain, Williams stepped forward without hesitation. He volunteered himself when his company needed someone willing to move forward into the withering machine gun fire pouring from those entrenched positions. With only 4 riflemen for cover, Corporal Williams pushed ahead alone. For 4 solid hours, he fought under relentless enemy fire, moving through the black sand with deliberate purpose. His aggressive determination and refusal to surrender the ground, despite the ruthless resistance he faced, transformed what seemed like an impossible situation into a breakthrough that allowed his company to advance. During the ceremony, Truman leaned toward Williams and said something that stayed with him the rest of his life. "I'd rather have this medal than be president." Williams replied without hesitation, "Sir, I'll trade you." Historians have spent decades analyzing what Williams accomplished that day and what it meant to the larger battle. The immediate tactical results were unmistakable. 300 yards of critical ground taken, multiple defensive strongpoints neutralized, and the breakthrough that opened the path to the airfield. By proving that Japanese fortifications could be broken through by one man with courage and unconventional thinking, Williams changed how the Marine Corps understood combat possibilities. His assault demonstrated that individual innovation could crack what seemed unbreakable. The psychological impact proved equally significant. Japanese strategy on Iwo Jima rested on one fundamental belief. Their fortifications were unbeatable, designed to hold out for weeks against any assault. Williams shattered that assumption in a single afternoon. Out of roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders on the island, only 183 survived the entire battle. Those who held the positions Williams attacked almost certainly died in those 4 hours. When fortifications that were supposed to be invincible fell so quickly, the shock reverberated through the surviving Japanese forces. Williams's techniques spread rapidly through the Marine Corps. Within a single day, new tactical guidelines based on his assault were moving through command channels. Short bursts of flame to stretch fuel supplies and keep him mobile, targeting ventilation systems and weak points in fortifications, using unpredictable movement as psychological pressure, immediately seizing positions after the enemy was suppressed, coordinating closely with riflemen as a unified team rather than operating independently. These methods transformed how flamethrower teams operated across the remainder of the Iwo Jima battle and later during the Okinawa campaign. The Marine Corps manuals underwent revision to incorporate his innovations, particularly the recognition that smoke could function as effectively as flame itself, and that attacking fortifications from unexpected angles often proved more valuable than direct assaults. To truly understand what Williams accomplished, you need to grasp what Iwo Jima itself cost. This 8-square-mile island of volcanic ash and rock became the grave for 6,121 Americans and wounded another 19,117 more across 36 days of ferocious combat. The Japanese garrison, following their orders, fought until they were essentially eliminated. Only 1,083 were captured, and most of those were so badly wounded they were unconscious. The island mattered because of those airfields. B-29 bombers, making the long journey from the Mariana Islands to strike targets across Japan, needed a place to put down in emergencies, and fighters stationed on Iwo Jima could escort those bombers to their destinations and back. Military strategists calculated that Iwo Jima saved approximately 24,161 American aircrew members who made emergency landings instead of ditching their crippled aircraft in the Pacific. Williams's 4 hours on February the 23rd formed just one piece of the larger battle, but it arrived at precisely the moment when the entire operation teetered on the edge of stalling. The Marines had been pushed back, casualties were accumulating relentlessly, and commanders were facing uncomfortable questions about whether capturing the island would cost more than the military could justify. By breaking through the deadlock at one of the airfields, Williams helped sustain the momentum that would eventually secure the entire island. When peace finally came, Williams returned to West Virginia and built a different kind of life. He worked for the Veterans Administration for more than 3 decades, helping veterans navigate bureaucratic systems so they could actually access the benefits they'd earned. He married Ruby Meredith in 1946, and together they raised 2 daughters. Yet like countless combat veterans, he carried invisible wounds that wouldn't heal with time. Williams recognized what would later be formally diagnosed as PTSD, and he refused to simply accept it as an unchangeable condition. He became a pioneer in establishing peer counseling programs for combat veterans in West Virginia, understanding deeply that the scars inside often cut far deeper than physical injuries ever could. In 1975, he testified before Congress with characteristic directness. "We train men to do terrible things in war, then expect them to forget when they come home. It doesn't work that way. The human mind doesn't simply erase what it's been forced to do." He devoted himself to honoring those who couldn't speak anymore. The Woody Williams Foundation, which took shape during his later years, has placed 108 Gold Star family monuments across America. These markers stand as permanent reminders that real families lost real loved ones, that military service demands the ultimate sacrifice from more than just the soldiers themselves. Stories circulated for years about Williams meeting Japanese survivors in 1985, but the documented record tells a different story. His first confirmed encounter with Japanese veterans came during the 70th anniversary observance in March 2015. Williams had actually avoided earlier reunions, protesting the American government's 1968 decision to return Iwo Jima to Japanese control. But decades of reflection changed his perspective. At that 2015 gathering, Williams stood face-to-face with Tsurugi Akikusa, the lone Japanese survivor able to make the journey back to the island. A PBS documentary captured that moment. 2 elderly men, former enemies who had tried to end each other's lives 7 decades earlier, now shaking hands on the black sand where they once faced each other across rifle sights and flamethrower flames. The image embodied something profound about human reconciliation, suggesting that even the deepest wounds of war could eventually heal. In his final years, Williams became a distinctive voice for honest conversation about warfare. He visited schools across America, speaking with unsparing candor about what he'd experienced. "War isn't like the movies or video games," he'd say. "It's not glorious or exciting. It's doing terrible things because the alternative is worse. I'm not proud of burning those bunkers. I'm proud that I helped my fellow Marines survive. There's a difference." His counsel to young people considering military service carried the weight of genuine experience. If you serve, you might be asked to do things that will haunt you forever. That's the real cost of military service, not the physical danger, but the moral weight. Make sure you're prepared for that. Make sure the cause is worth carrying that weight for the rest of your life. Military academics at institutions like the Naval War College studied Williams' assault as a defining moment in how small units conduct combat. His achievement demonstrated something fundamental: individual initiative, when merged with tactical creativity, could achieve effects that rippled across entire battles. His innovations influenced American military thinking in 5 distinct ways: empowering individual soldiers to modify tactics based on real-time conditions, treating fear itself as a weapon as lethal as explosives, coordinating separate actions into unified operations, adapting doctrine instantly based on what the battlefield demanded, and recognizing moral courage, accepting the psychological burden that comes with necessary violence. His combat experience directly shaped the evolution of flamethrower technology. When Williams showed that psychological effect didn't require continuous streams of flame, engineers redesigned nozzles for improved fuel conservation. His use of smoke as a primary offensive weapon led to new attachments specifically designed to generate smoke. The pairing of flamethrower operators with rifle teams became standard practice, replacing the old approach of treating flamethrowers as independent specialists. By the time Korean War began, American flamethrower doctrine had fully absorbed Williams' innovations into standard procedure. The M2A1 flamethrower that succeeded the M22 model, Williams used extended effective range to 50 yards and incorporated improvements directly suggested by his combat reports and post-action analysis. The moral dimensions of flamethrower warfare haunted Williams throughout his life. In a 1995 interview, he struggled openly with the complexity. People want war to be clean, honorable like in the movies. It's not. It's doing horrible things to stop even more horrible things. Every man in those bunkers was somebody's son, maybe a husband or father. They were soldiers doing their duty just like me. But if I hadn't cleared those bunkers, hundreds of Marines would have died taking them. So I chose to be the monster so others wouldn't have to be. That moral burden, the weight of violence rendered necessary by circumstance, shaped everything Williams did after the war. He became a consistent voice for recognizing what warfare actually costs, not just in lives tallied in body counts, but in the psychological toll carved into those who survive. The numbers from Williams' 4-hour assault, though debated in some particulars, remain extraordinary in scope. He destroyed somewhere between 3 and 7 heavily reinforced concrete pillboxes, depending on which account you examine. He sustained continuous combat for 4 full hours. He carried 68 pounds of equipment and managed multiple loads of fuel, refueling several times during the assault. His breakthrough enabled 300 yards of critical ground to be captured in the subsequent advance. The casualty rate in his sector dropped by 40% after the breakthrough was secured, yet these statistics barely capture the ripple effects. The advance he enabled accelerated the capture of the airfield ahead of the original schedule, which meant B-29 bombers could use the field for emergency landings weeks earlier than planned. Williams aged into his final years carrying a singular distinction. He was the last living Medal of Honor recipient from the entire Pacific War. The responsibility of being the final voice for those who perished weighed on him profoundly. He created the Herschel Woodrow Williams Medal of Honor Foundation to ensure Gold Star families received the recognition they deserved. He testified repeatedly before Congress about veteran issues and the gap between promised support and actual delivery. He participated in documentaries determined to preserve the historical record. Even as his physical health deteriorated in his later years, he kept making public appearances, driven by the conviction that his fellow Marines' sacrifices could never be allowed to fade from national memory. On June 29, 2022, Williams passed away at age 98 in Huntington, West Virginia. An era concluded with his death. The last Medal of Honor recipient from World War II was gone. His funeral reflected the nation's recognition of his extraordinary service. Marines carried his casket, and his body lay in honor inside the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. a privilege reserved for America's most distinguished figures. Williams's story extends far beyond the specific circumstances of one island battle to reveal universal truths about warfare and human character. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action taken despite fear. Williams was terrified throughout those 4 hours, yet he continued advancing because duty to his fellow Marines overwhelmed his own terror. Innovation emerges from desperation. Williams didn't devise his tactics through formal planning sessions. He developed them through desperate improvisation, the only way he could see to survive and succeed. Individual actions can cascade into strategic consequences. One man's determination across 4 hours altered the trajectory of a major battle and influenced military doctrine for decades. Heroism exacts costs that extend far beyond any immediate battlefield. Williams carried psychological weight for 77 years after the war ended. True strength sometimes means the capacity to reconcile with former enemies. Williams eventually found peace with Japanese veterans, demonstrating that people who tried to kill each other could eventually find common ground. Williams's experience carries direct relevance to modern military operations. Contemporary urban warfare emphasizes precision and civilian protection, seemingly light years removed from flamethrower assaults. Yet the principles Williams embodied, tactical flexibility, psychological operations, individual initiative, remain central to military success. In an era of increasingly sophisticated technology, Williams reminds us that battles are fundamentally won by individual courage and resourcefulness. Technology evolves, but the human element remains decisive. Weapon systems change, but the requirement for warriors willing to face danger for their comrades never changes. Herschel Woodrow Williams left multiple legacies woven through different communities. To the Marine Corps, he provided tactical innovations that saved innumerable lives and influenced doctrine for decades. To veterans, he offered genuine advocacy and understanding for the invisible wounds that lingered long after physical healing. To Gold Star families, he gave monuments ensuring their sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten by future generations. To military historians, he left detailed testimony about what genuine combat heroism actually entails. Perhaps his most significant legacy was his unwavering honesty about war. Williams never romanticized what he accomplished on February 23, 1945. He didn't celebrate the destruction he caused or glamorize combat experiences. Instead, he spoke with brutal candor about the terrible necessities of warfare and the enduring costs of survival. "War will ask you to do terrible things," he told his grandson, a Marine preparing for deployment shortly before Williams' own death. "If you must do them completely, do them quickly, and then spend the rest of your life making sure they were worth it." The fundamental story of Corporal Herschel Woodrow Williams transcends the precise count of pillboxes destroyed or the specific tactical methodologies employed. It's fundamentally about one person facing an apparently impossible situation who found the courage to act when action seemed certain to be fatal. It's about generating innovation under the most extreme imaginable pressure. It's about carrying the burden of necessary violence with dignity across nearly 8 decades of life after combat. Williams embodied a different kind of strength, not that of someone who loves war, but someone who hated suffering enough to end it quickly, whatever personal price that demanded. He didn't take pleasure in what he did on February 23, 1945. He simply did what the moment demanded, with precision and courage that broke enemy resistance and inspired his comrades to continue fighting. On that day on Iwo Jima, a small man from West Virginia became a towering figure in military history, not because he enjoyed violence, but because he possessed the willingness to bear its burden so others wouldn't have to carry it themselves. The bunkers he destroyed have long since crumbled into history, but the lessons from his assault about courage, tactical creativity, and the true price of warfare remain vitally relevant today. His story reminds us that heroism exists not in the pursuit of glory or fame, but in carrying the weight of necessary choices with integrity and then devoting your remaining years to preventing others from having to bear similar weights. In those 4 hours on Iwo Jima, Williams demonstrated that even in humanity's darkest moments, individual courage can create illumination. even if that light emerges from the terrible brightness of a flamethrower wielded by someone reluctant to use it, but willing to do whatever his fellow Marines needed. The Marine who terrified Japanese defenders ultimately transformed into an advocate for peace, understanding deeply that those who have witnessed war's true face are often best positioned to oppose it. Through his evolution from warrior to educator, from destroyer to voice for reconciliation, Williams showed that the greatest victory isn't winning wars, it's preventing them from happening. His life stands as evidence of a simple but profound truth. Sometimes one person really does change everything. On February 23, 1945, Corporal Herschel Woodrow Williams proved exactly that.